Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to today's research seminar at the Institute for Future Studies. My name is Göran Soterström, and I'm a professor of political science at Gothenburg University and a researcher here in the Institute. And I'm delighted to welcome today Säde Hormio, who's a postdoctoral researcher in practical philosophy at the University of Helsinki. We have been running, we're currently running a workshop on climate ethics and emissions accounting at the Institute, and Säde is giving this sort of seminar or perhaps keynote address in the context of that workshop. So Säde's work focuses on shared and collective responsibility and social epistemology. She wrote her doctoral thesis on collective responsibility for climate change, for which she earned her PhD in 2018. And she was awarded a Marie Curie fellowship following that. She's currently also part of a project based here in Stockholm, based on the which is about the ethics of coordination, which is led by Christer Byqvist, also at the Institute. So Säde is the author of numerous articles. She's the co-editor of a book entitled The Ethical Underpinnings of Climate Economics, and currently working on her first monograph with the provisional or definitive title, Taking Responsibility for Climate Change, which is under contract with Palgrave. So the floor is yours, Säde. We look forward to listening to your talk.
Thank you very much, Göran, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and it's been a very enjoyable first day of workshop yesterday, so I hope today will be good as well. So I'll be talking about individual emissions, equality, and the state. So I'm really interested in all my work about the kind of the relationship of individual and collective responsibility for climate change, because it's such a vast problem, and then we're saying, okay, sure, so collective actors are responsible, but what do we really mean by it? So that's always like the theme that runs through all the work that I do. So my main questions, I have two main questions for the talk today. So originally, I was talking when it is fair to divide emissions of a state between its citizens. And I am, it has different aspects. So there's emissions of like how much you should emit from now on, what should you do about like historical emissions of the state, how you should in general divide the carbon budget, how you should do, pay for mitigation adaptation. So there's lots of questions built into this. But I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. I'm going to answer this question straight away. When is it fair? In the current world, almost never. You would have to have a very kind of egalitarian state with very like a democratic state where people like get to have their say in things, and they have quite similar emissions. And I would say even if you would have this very I don't know, a lovely authoritarian who would like equally divide everything in their country, that still wouldn't qualify, because, if the people wouldn't have a say in it. So I really don't think there's really much that would qualify for this at the moment. So it kind of makes it a bit uninteresting question. So I actually, when I was writing this, I actually thought that I'd rather ask, why is it not fair to divide emissions of a state between its citizens? And then the more interesting question that follows from this is what implications this has for climate ethics, and what is the role of emissions accounting of individuals? So these are the two questions I'll be addressing today. And I, as Göran said, this is, I'm writing my first book at the moment, provisionally titled Taking Responsibility for Climate Change, and is looking at the individual and collective responsibility questions. So this is part of a much like wider argument, what I'm presenting here. This is just one part of one chapter. So that's why if you're thinking, wow, this is a bit too wide for journal article, yes, it is. And it's not a journal article, it's part of the book. So just to put it in the context. So let's get started. This is what I'm going to be talking about. The first part of the talk will be I'm just giving you background to the issue. Why in general should we care? What is the urgency? What do we mean by carbon inequality? And also this discussion about consumption and production-based accounting. So the first section is just giving you all background to these issues. And then the second part will be problems with dividing state emissions to citizens. So why I just don't think it really makes sense in the current world. And then the third part is what I will call super-polluters and implications of these super-polluters for climate ethics, or why I think we should really focus on super-polluters also in climate ethics. So that's what I'll be talking about. So let's get started on the first one. So background. This issue is super urgent. The amount of greenhouse gases that can still be emitted to the atmosphere is very limited if we're going to keep the total global greenhouse gas emissions to what we are with the current knowledge thinking is still the safe limit, so 1.5. And of course, you know, we don't know if this is actually even possible anymore. We wasted a lot of time. We don't know with all the feedback mechanisms and things like if we could achieve it, like what would we actually keep it to? What would be the final effects? So so there's a lot of uncertainty about it. But what we do know is that things will get a lot worse if we don't hit these targets. So there's no uncertainty about that. But the real problem that we have really little time now. So if we're looking at the cumulative emissions of the last decade, so just from 2010 to 2019, we have emitted about as much as there is still room to emit in the total carbon budget of the world to keep it warming to this 1.5 degree. And this is from the IPCC's latest, the sixth assessment report that came out, the working group 3, so the mitigation part. And some of the graphs that I'll be showing you are also from that same latest IPCC report. And the worst thing with the urgency, if things weren't bad enough, is also accelerating. So it's not like, hey, we're making great progress and things are just about to turn better. They're not. They're just getting worse. 62% of the total cumulative carbon emissions from 1850 to 2019, so from a really long period of time, they occurred since 1970. So in the last 50 years. And then about 43% since 1990. And 17% since 2010. So the situation is dire and it just keeps getting worse. So that's why it's like a really, really urgent question. And here we just see what I said. This is also from the same IPCC report. So it just shows you how the global net emissions have been going up since 1990. Okay, so carbon inequality. What do we mean by it? So if we are going to divide this remaining carbon budget in some sort of fair manner, we have to have some sort of principles, some sort of discussion about it, and there's lots of discussion all the time. There's just not many answers at the moment that people agree on, either on the practical or theoretical level. So that is like a big unresolved question. Both in terms of like who's paying for mitigation and adaptation and who should be allowed to emit and how much. This is something that that we are very much still debating. And the important thing, these emissions are very unequal between regions and states, both historically and at present. So it's not that we don't only know what to do, it's also like the situation has been unequal from the start and it's still very unequal. And these differences are especially stark if we're looking at the per capita level emissions. So if we move from the state level or region level to the individual emitters. And here are some charts, again from the same IPCC report from this year. So you can just see that here's the historical cumulative emissions on the first chart there. And it just shows how unequal they are. So North America is leading the pack very clearly there, with Europe coming a good second. So definitely climate change has not been caused by us all equally. It's not that kind of a problem. And then on the second chart, you'll see what it looks like per capita. So and then you can see that it's still extremely unequal. And again, from the IPCC report, this is the kind of based on the latest data they have. So this is looking at how much you can see the like percentages of the contributions. What I want to just highlight here is if we're looking at the per capita figures, so you can really see the inequality here. So this is like greenhouse gas emissions in carbon tons equivalent, and in North America that's 19, whereas in Southern Asia that's 2.6 on the per capita level. So we're really talking about big differences here, not just like a little bit of inequality, like vast inequality. And you might have noticed in that chart that I just showed you that in the last level there was two different lines. There was production-based and consumption-based accounting. And before we look at them, I'm just going to quickly explain what they are. I know a lot of you in the audience know what they are and know more about them than I do, but just to kind of quickly summarize. So the idea is like what emissions in general should we count in the carbon budget of a state. If you were looking at production-based accounting, then these are emissions that take within the borders of a state. But if you're looking at the consumption-based accounting, then these are emissions that are consumed in that country regardless of where they are produced. So for example, if they're exported raw materials or consumer goods, then that's actually should go into the ledger of the country that is actually consuming them rather than the one that's producing them. And what is the difference between these two things in practice? Then what kind of figures do we get? So if we go back to these IPCC figures, you can see that if you, for example, look at Africa, which has the lowest production-based emissions, 1.2. And then we look at North America, that's 16. So you see the inequality there, as with other figures. But then if we go to the consumption, this is so we're still not like there is no surprises in that sense that all of a sudden some region like jumps into a totally different position that it wasn't in before. But I mean these inequalities are just again that little bit stronger. And of course this is, even though they're not and these are the regions that I've highlighted that will have higher consumption-based emissions if we go for this type of accounting. So the production-based is the one that has been used traditionally so far. But there's a lot of arguments for consumption-based accounting. But then, you know, we don't. It's not like it has been accepted yet, but it's definitely making inroads, I think, to these discussions. So what are the kind of pros and cons of consumption-based accounting? So the biggest maybe pro is that it addresses the problem of carbon leakage. So so it kind of, if you have a state that then has very highly polluting industry and is consuming a lot of these highly polluting goods, and then it's just you know, like it puts like very stringent emissions accounting, and then it's then this production moves to another country with less stringent emission standards, then, you know, the total emissions don't go down at all. Of course, they might even go up, whereas then it still looks like that this country or region has done something. So that's the main. Like issue that this can take carbon leakage into account. And that it also takes into account where these goods are consumed, which is often the driver of demand. So I'm not saying this is the only driver of demand. It's very complicated what's demanding you know, supply or demand, these things. But generally, there's still, and especially with the unequal power relations with a lot of this trading, like, you know, there is need for richer countries for certain goods, and then they purchase it. So it's actually, in that sense, driving the emissions in the other countries. But of course, the big con is like, is it feasible? Like, you know, we don't know yet, but it hasn't been used in these kind of international agreements in that sense, even though it's been a lot in debate. So And also Göran has an article on this where he kind of said, like, you know, if it's like, even if it would be just, and then if it, but it wouldn't be feasible, then of course it wouldn't be the one that we want to go with. But this is just to let you know, like, what in general we would put into these carbon budgets. But now let's move on to these problems of then dividing these state emissions to citizens, why I don't think it makes sense. So if you look at some trends in carbon inequality, this is from Chancel and Piketty 2015 paper. They actually like, so if we're looking now at the very big global picture of emissions of everybody who is emitting, then these emission inequalities between individuals actually have been decreasing lately, and that's been driven by two things. So those, the dates are there only because that's between the Kyoto and the Paris Agreement. So that's why they chose those dates. But the idea is that there has been, you know, developing, like, a lot of people have been like lifted from extreme poverty, like globally. So they are now consuming more. So there has been this rise of top and mid income groups in developing countries, and this has been one of the drivers, and then also combined with this relative stagnation of incomes and emissions of the majority of the population in industrialized economies. So in that sense, there's been some catching up. But over that same period, these greenhouse gas emission inequalities have increased within countries. And this has like two impacts. So you have even more unequal situation within countries, of course, but it also means that there is this kind of new group of these super emitters that I'll be calling, that are like driving emissions in the world at the moment. So it's kind of created that because that inequality keeps increasing. And here's just an example. So UK is not the worst country or anything. They just had this interesting report that came out recently this autumn. So that's why I'm just using this as an example, called the Climate Fund for Climate Action. So they are having this figure there that in the UK, the top 1% of earners by income generate roughly the same carbon emissions in a year than the bottom 10% of people in the UK have done in the past 26 years. So, I mean, this is like an example of a quite vast inequality within a country. And you can see there's a chart here that just shows you the same thing. So here we have in that in the single color one, we have the top 1% in UK doing their emissions, and then we have the other the scales or whatever you want to call them. They call them deciles, and then if you put them on top of each other, we're getting we're getting to the same thing as the bottom 9 income groups combined. So, I mean, it's a lot. Okay, but it's not like we only have these super polluters within like rich countries that are already polluting a lot. We have them across the world. They're not restricted just to the wealthy countries that have these high per capita emissions anyway. So low per capita emissions of a country do not automatically translate to only a few super polluters. And it just seems to me that you're more likely to find these potential super polluters in countries with high economic inequality, regardless of the per capita emissions of that place. So you have South Africa, United States, Brazil, India, for example, that are some of the countries that are really leading the inequality in this thing. And here you can see a picture of how this this is from Oxfam's report, how these per capita lifestyle consumption emissions have, how they like split in G20 countries that they had data available. So you can really see like United States is one of the most, I mean, it's the most polluting country still, but it's still, it's also one of the most with unequal emissions within its citizens. And then we have like Canada and Britain and Germany and Italy. So this is like, you can find this in a lot of places. but it's changing. It's changing quite rapidly at the moment. So this is what is projected to happen. This is also from Oxfam's report from last year on carbon inequality. So this is what's projected to change. So at the moment, you can see that United States. So now, so this is the world richest 1% now. So sometimes I'm talking about the 10%. Now sometimes I'm talking about the 1%. So now we're talking about the really super rich people. Not just the top 10, but the ones that I would call super polluters. So this is at the moment, you know, they're very much based in United States, 37%. But so these are projections. Of course, we don't know if this is exactly going to happen, but it's going to be China is going to take over by 2030. Also, you can really see that India is going to be doubling its super polluters, and European Union is going down on this as well. But I mean, in general, you can see that there's a big category of other countries. So, you know, you really can find super polluters pretty much anywhere. And then you can, and then in some sense, like if you look at the inequality within a country, you know, of course, if you have a, say, authoritarian regime where all the cronies and the people in power are like spending all the carbon, and they can be spending vast amounts of money and having vast emissions, then, you know, of course, that is a very unequal situation, but can also be driving a lot of emissions between just like a tiny elite within a country. So we should account super polluters wherever they are. That's the point. So yeah, so the point is that then why does it make sense to allocate them for within states is because there's these huge inequalities. So, and it's very problematic to assume that the states are these kind of unitary collective actors. So that if you give a if you do some, you know, states are very, they are collective actors, but they're kind of very, they're not in the most kind of corporated sense at the same time, even though they're they're very legally strong. But if you think of something like more like a corporation or an association, and other ones, they are much smaller corporate agents, but we're usually thinking about like in terms of like dividing something between like some sort of collective. States are really vast, and states have very, very different situations. And this is not something that I've invented on myself. This is something that has been noted by others in the literature. So, for example, notably Simon Caney, when he was writing in 2009 about allocating emission permits, he pointed out that this is morally problematic. Doing so treats states as homogeneous units, even though there are large differences between citizens on how much they emit. So it's just too simplistic. And also Bear et al. Have suggested that climate rights and responsibilities should be explored from the viewpoint of their impacts on individual classes, of individuals or classes of individuals. So you are not looking at that just like, oh, this is a policy, and now we're looking at how it's going to impact China, or how it's going to impact India, or how it's going to impact the United States. That you have to look at take this into account when you're looking at any policies. And this is just because even if you're applying these to the states, the effects of rights and responsibilities will be very different between the citizens of a state, according to the economic class and how equal the state is. And I just want to, like, before I'm soon going to be wrapping up this section, but I just really I love this. I don't love the content of this slide, but I love the visualness of this slide. It's from Oxfam's report, and this is it really hammers it home how unequal it is. So now we're again talking about the richest 10%, but I mean it is really really unequal, and it's like just good to see it visually. So that just means that the poorest 50% of the world's population is responsible for only around 10% of the total lifestyle consumption emissions. And there is this kind of twofold injustice there. So not only are some people really getting all the benefits of these emissions that we're putting into the global commons of the atmosphere, also others are much more vulnerable to it. And usually the thing goes that the ones who are emitting the less, and this is well known in climate economics, are the ones who are actually most vulnerable. So here is a picture from floods in Bangladesh in 2019. And it's just, it's usually one of the standard example that's given in climate ethics of a really like low-lying country that has all this extended flooding due to the climate change effects. It's already bad, it's just getting worse, and they're also a poor country, so their emissions are not high, but they're still already feeling the impacts, you know, very badly. But it's not just within like the rich countries and poor countries. So here's a picture from United States. This is from Los Angeles, so a very rich country, very rich state, California. But this is like a picture of an area of California. No, sorry, California, of Los Angeles, where if you look at it, there's not many trees, is there? It's pretty gray. And this is not like by chance, like, oh, we forgot to plant trees. This is like impact of a long line of these originally very racist policies where people were divided into different areas of the cities, called redlining, and then how that has over the years just kind of been reproduced, and the economic inequality. And what happens if you don't have trees is when there's a heat wave, and in California you do get heat waves, it has a lot of other bad health impacts, but it also means without the shade of the trees, like these areas, some of the city areas get really considerably hotter than others. So there's like these hot spots within cities, and those are the spots where they don't have the trees. You don't get the shade, so it gets even more harder to kind of survive in these kinds of areas during heat waves. So it's also linked to, again, the climate vulnerability that you can find even in developed countries. And if you're interested in this picture is from esri.com, and they have this thing about the shade equity in Los Angeles. And I think what's interesting to talk about this inequality and emissions accounting and everything at the moment is that we're like technology is like taking huge leaps on how much we're getting this data. So it's not just like things that estimates and ledgers and what people are saying and what states are saying, how much they're using and stuff. So here's a recent example from this initiative called Climate Trace. You can find it online. It's there, and you can search it with all kinds of different ways you want this data. So they're actually getting it from satellite images, and then they are mixing it with various other things. And this is not, it's not like a peer-reviewed yet, so they really wanted to just put the data out there. They're planning to write like also scientific peer-reviewed articles about this. So, but just the disclaimer that not peer-reviewed yet. But anyway, this is just the way, like, you know, like that technology can, you know, it allows you to see in real time where the emission hotspots are, and it allows them to really like track them, so they are showing like individual like sites of these emissions as well, an oil field or a factory or other things. So I mean, when these kinds of technologies keep developing, then that's it's going to make it even make more sense for us to talk about like really looking at more fine-grained emissions and what should we do about it, like, or like accounting of like these are these groups or these groups within this state or these individuals or these individual collective corporations or other things. So I just think it's interesting how the technology is really developing fast. Okay, so let's get now to the final part. So that's the super-polluters and then the implications for climate ethics. So in climate ethics, it's very, very standard that when we're starting to talk about individual and collective responsibility, then the collective harm problem comes up. And collective harm problems are not just something that is applied to climate change. It's just usually seen that this is like one of the most kind of extreme examples of a collective harm problem and a very kind of complicated example of it. But in general, in collective harm problems, agents act in a way that collectively causes harm, or you're failing to prevent some harm, but no individual act appears to make a difference on its own. So that's the idea, that you have this big collective harm, but then it still seems that whatever the individuals do, it doesn't really impact on the harm, but the collective is responsible. But what does that mean, and who should actually be doing anything about it? So and this is like I'm sure many of you are familiar with Derek Parfit's famous like thought experiments on this, on people like dying out in desert, and like who should be helping them, or harmless torturers, and all these other ones that I'm not going to go into here. But this is just like a very kind of standard starting assumption in a lot of climate ethics things. So the idea is, when acting in a certain way seems to make no difference to the outcome, then it's difficult to see how we might have a reason to act or choose to refrain from acting in such a way. And there's just some examples here of the references of climate ethicists who've been writing about this from the point of view of climate ethics. So there's lots of literature on this. And where all this literature kind of usually most of it, so they disagree on what should be do about it and how much you're responsible and for what reasons you're responsible. But usually what they are agreeing is kind of this insufficiency of individual actions. And this is one of the first ones was Johnson in 2003 was writing that it would be a mistake to view it as our obligation to unilaterally reduce our individual burden on the climate, as this has little chance of making any difference in the absence of a collective agreement on reductions. So that's the basic idea, and there's been a lot of probably the most famous one is by Walter Synod Armstrong about like going on your gas guzzling Sunday ride for no good reason, but and you're still emitting gases, but then at the same time there's he's arguing that there is no moral principle that gets you on the hook, because it actually is, you're not actually causing anything. You're not it's just it's totally insufficient and not necessary for climate change. So you cannot pin it on the individuals. And then what people are saying then, well, what's the solution to this? A problem of insufficiency or inefficiency, and that's that individuals should seek cooperation scheme to address the problem. This is also already what Johnson was saying, and a lot of other people have argued this. And I mean, Synod Armstrong himself was saying that, yeah, we need to lobby our governments to get climate policy right, and Elizabeth Cripps has written a very influential book on this as well, on that we should come together and we have these duties to coordinate, and then we should approach climate change through political action. So that's the standard way how the arguments usually go when we're discussing this huge problem of climate change, and then what should individuals do about it. So this is the standard way. Of course, not everybody agrees, because that would be very boring if there would be something in philosophy that everybody agrees. So the most notable exception is John Broome, who's written that the cumulative nature of the emissions and the very long time they stay in the atmosphere, combined with the butterfly effect, means that all individual emissions are expected to cause harm in the long run. So, so you might not say that this is this particular flood or this particular storm, but, carbon can stay in the atmosphere for 1,000 years, methane, much shorter, maybe 30 years, but I mean that's so much more potent gas then again, so that still has chances during those decades it's there to cause a lot of harm. So it's just there's just so much uncertainty, and it's cumulative, and there's the butterfly effect, so it would be just silly to say that it doesn't cause any harm. That's his argument. They're expected to cause harm in the long run. So yeah, so that's his argument. And also Marion Hordequin has just argued earlier that changing this framing of climate change from this atomistic to relational, then this can help us appreciate how our personal choices have also these communicative and social functions. So we are affecting each other, and there's other people who have written about, for example, that even if it might not affect these particle emissions from this source, and especially because a lot of these things are structural. You know, I can't like change the way like my I can maybe impact like the way my house is heated depending on where I'm living, but I can't impact the way my children's school is heated, for example. So these kinds of things. But what we can do is with our choices, we can signal to each other, and we can signal support to the greener choices. And I actually agree with them. I'm actually in the camp where I think this problem has been overemphasized. But I do think it's at the same time you have to really keep it in mind that when we're talking about individual emissions, there's the structures, and individuals are these actors within these wider social and economic structures. So it's not like fair to just go like, oh, here's your carbon footprint and you're responsible for it, because that would be very naive and silly. So yeah, I do think it's complicated, but not maybe for the reasons that for example, Johnson originally said. Okay, so that's usually how the individuals are, you know, that's the story of the individual responsibility for climate change. But I think like we're really underestimating the problem of inequality if that's the only story we want to tell about individual responsibility for climate change. So I'm saying that's an important story. I'm not saying it's the wrong story or anything. I'm just saying it's not the whole story. So, and this is again, now we go back to what I was saying in the beginning about the urgency of this issue. So nearly half of the total growth in absolute emissions was due to the richest 10% in the world, with the richest 5% alone contributing over a third, so 37%. And this comes from the Cambridge Sustainability Commission report that came out, I think 2 years ago. You can find it online. But I mean, this is this is like really like this is what's driving the increased emissions, which we really can't afford. Like even if we'd stop now emitting at the levels like cap where we are at the moment, we're still in deep trouble. You know, we have to really go to the net zero, but like they're increasing, and who's driving it? It is the top. And Oxfam has said, and I think they put it in these nicest terms. So they've released few of these very influential reports in the past. First one linked with the Paris negotiations, and then after that, the latest one was last year. And they're putting this really nicely, starkly, that if we want to hold on to the 1.5 degree goal, like if it's in any way feasible, we either have to like really address these super polluters, or then if we want to maintain these high carbon footprints of the super polluters, then this requires that the rest of us requires far deeper emission cuts for the rest of the world. I mean, and some of us will be in that 10%, by the way. We might not be in the 1%. I don't know about your finances, but I certainly am nowhere near that. But yeah, so there are definitely there's lots in the literature, but the figures, you know, of course, they keep changing. Like, you know, there's because depending on like on the latest like data, but there is a lot of like there is like actual like dollar figures and stuff you can like find easily. But I just thought not to include them here because that's kind of beyond the point, because it's still the idea is that there's this huge inequality, and that's what I really want to emphasize. But you can easily find them, and then they explain them. For example, in the Cambridge report or the Oxfam report, they explain what they're using, or the IPCC. But yeah, maybe I should have brought in some examples. But yeah, so basically, a lot of the middle classes in high polluting countries will find themselves in the 10%, but they won't find themselves in the 1%. And those, my 1% are my super polluters. But maintaining such high carbon footprints among the world's richest people, so either requires that there's far deeper emission cuts by the rest of the country, or it entails that the global heating is going to go in excess of 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, and there is just no other alternative. So it's just, if we want to hold on to this, we have to address it. And here is from the same report, so Oxfam's report last year. It's a figure of what's projected to happen by 2030, and what's going to projected to be compatible with this 1.5 degree per capita level. So in China, the consumption emissions of half of the population are set to remain below the 1.5 per capita target, while those of the richest 1%, so these are now again the super-polluters, they are set to rise dramatically. In United States, the national per capita consumption emissions are set to fall by about half from 2015 to 2030, but to a level that is still 4 times what we would need to reach 1.5. So and in India, it's going, the super polluters are going higher fast as well. So the purple one is the richest 1, and you can really, so this is what is projected to be the case in 2030. So it's the richest 1% is really getting richer if the current trends continue. So what should be done about this then? So this is stuff that you can find in the literature. What are people suggesting that should be like done if we want to address this? So progressive carbon taxes, introduce them especially for these excessive emissions. So so a lot of, pretty much all of the literature is suggesting this. And of course, you know, there's carbon taxes in over 30 countries at the moment, but, well, maybe 35, 33, 35. Anyway, so it's not like politically unfeasible, but of course there's certain countries where they haven't been introduced at all because people are thinking that they won't wash, like in the United States, and they were trying to have some carbon taxes and they were shut down in the when they were coming up with the climate bill. So I'm not saying this is super easy. These are just some of the suggestions that you can find. And then also just taxation on extreme wealth. This is something that is suggested by Oxfam, for example. So just like, because this extreme wealth is driving these extreme emissions, then, you know, you just should maybe like really tax the extreme wealth and bring it down to a more tolerable level. And what's really important is changing consumption incentives and structures, of course. So, and this is to do with the kind of, for example, what kind of power is available in the country, what kind of public transportation is available, what kind of food we're subsidizing, all kinds of things that these will impact. So it's not like consumers just do whatever they want, they do respond to incentives. So this is like changing the incentives at the state level. Then there's also a suggestion of lifestyle leapfrogging in the Cambridge report. And that just means that when the developing countries are entering new consumption patterns, that they maybe, like the richer countries would help them to leapfrog through some of the more kind of polluting stages of consumption into the kind of greener pathway, so they wouldn't go through the same way that we in Europe, for example, have gone through. And then, of course, that requires that there's technology transfers, for example. And then money also for money for this. And in general, there should be like open debate on values of how should we consume better and less. So like the more there is discussion of this in the public arena in any way or shape or form, you know, that is always good. So we're like questioning, like this is just how things happen to be at the moment, but this is not some sort of this is not an inevitable way we have to run our world. This is not an inevitable situation. So like, how could we like like we should question really these norms. And by that I don't mean like just doing like things like shaming people who are flying, for example. It doesn't have to go through the negative as well. And I think it's actually, and the most people, I would say in that top 10% at least, probably also in top 1, but they will also feel like they want this situation to change. It's not like they're just going, ha ha, we're having great time and the rest of you suckers are suffering. That's not like the situation. Like, people in general are worried about climate change. They want to make this situation better. But it's often there's this feeling like, well, I can't impact things, and well, I'm just one person in this big world, and well, everybody else is doing it. And so it's all this kind of like, we're in this kind of state of like, we can't do anything at this shit. I'm sorry. So that's like what's happening, and there should be more like just like also discussion on like kind of the positive side, not just like making people feel guilty, you naughty person, you know, doing these emissions, but also like, hey, what do we want as humanity? Like, do we really want to just this thing to just go on like this, or are there other alternatives? And it's usually, and in general, like, our preferences change, you know. So it's not like if you prefer doing something like this, it doesn't mean like that will be your preferences in 5 years time, you know. They respond to incentives in general when we think things through as well, and especially if it's like a big societal discussion, like our preferences also change with times. So so it's completely possible that the wider you have these debates and the more kind of we need kind of vision, you know, for this as well, like, because it's so doom and gloom. It's like, well, what do we want to achieve with this? And that has to be kind of open debate. But part of that is also like really problematizing this. And of course, like, inequality has been like the hot topic for the past 10 years at least. So and people and NGOs especially are pushing for this debate, but we need more of it. Like, really like, well, this is not a good situation. What are we going to do about it? And also like how there can be joy of you know, there's, you know, you're reducing maybe your status anxiety, and a lot of people have been talking about this with like with the weirdness of the past few years, you know, like how all of a sudden they realize, oh, they don't care that much about buying new clothes, for example, or something like that. So these can also have kind of liberating effects. And of course, then we also need governance innovations. So, for example, through mini publics, and just in general, I'm a big fan of like participatory democracy, and I think often when we're like stuck in thinking about stuff in a certain way, we need like more input from like kind of outside perspectives that are not thinking in the same jaded ways, that are kind of like, oh, this is what we've tried and this doesn't gonna work. And there's like success stories already. For example, like in Ireland, that's quite a famous story, you know, like when they had their citizens assembly, and how that actually like helped then the politicians, because it was linked to the parliament. That's important, that is not just these discussion groups that are happening and then nothing happens afterwards. When the citizen assembly, they were actually putting forward much more ambitious climate policy that the government had thought to put forward, and it went through because they noticed that, okay, so there is, and that seems to be the thing also. Some of my colleagues are doing these mini publics in Finland, and there seems to be more support for like stringent regulation even in areas where the politicians think there isn't. So there seems people want things to change, and this is one way of like opening up those gridlocks, and also that, and then, you know, Ireland jumped from having one of the least impressive policies into one of the most progressive ones. But then also we need maybe choice editing. And then this comes like, so it's just not all carrots. There needs to be maybe sticks as well. And this is what choice editing means, is that you're basically like through regulation and other means, you're like just cutting away some of the choices. Maybe there's some stuff we really shouldn't be doing right now. And I'm going to give you 2 examples from that, from Oxfam, what they're saying, like, you know, so again, remember, we have very little carbon budget left. We have very little time. Inequality is rising. Emissions are rising. What are like some of the things maybe we shouldn't be doing? So when we're talking now about the super-polluters, the top 1%, one of the main emissions that's driving that 1%'s mega emissions is super yachts, you know. So they're actually really, really huge carbon monsters. So Oxfam is saying, well, maybe these should be like actually regulated out of the market at the moment. Maybe this is not something we should be allowing at this current climate. And another of their example is space travel. Is this really like the best time to introduce space travel when we are like back against the wall with carbon emissions anyway, and like one space flight is like 100 times of the average flying, and flying is already one of the biggest problems of the 1%, along with the super yachts, and then we're introducing like space tourism at that time. So I don't want to be like a spoil sport. I'd love to go to space and stuff, and I think that's all great. But maybe we can find like more net zero way of getting into space in the future, and maybe there's some of this stuff that should be like not that we shouldn't be going forward with at this moment in time. I'm just about to wrap up, but I wanted to say as well, it's not just the consumption of the 1%. A lot of them are also part of the economic and political elites of the world, whether it's in like Wall Street or the US Senate, for example. They're very they're notorious from having like most of the senators are millionaires. So it's not just like so they have also power to keep the structures going, and I'm not saying that they want to keep the structures going. A lot of them want change as well, but they also have invested interest wider than just their own consumption, especially through investments. So you don't necessarily, it's not going to be the easiest thing to push for this, because there is a lot of power there, and also the other thing is that they do have a lot of their like primary responsibility then as individuals is not to just reduce their own personal consumption, is actually to really use their powerful positions in society to do good. So even though they have this big responsibility, it might not be their kind of main responsibility. So this is like then in the bigger picture of climate change responsibility, where I think everything that I just said fits in. And this is what I'm going to be talking about in the wider book. So the organized agential collectives are in much better position to take action than individuals. So yeah, we should put most of when we're talking about responsibility, who should be doing stuff for climate change, we should put it on collective agents. And I think what's very important is that we have this shared responsibility also as members of these collective agents. And this is usually for most of us in the room as well, it's like the main way we can actually affect climate change, not through our personal reducing our emissions. It's kind of stuff we can do in our workplaces, for example, of changing the work culture, changing like the way we're doing things, looking at the emissions of the particular like organized collectives that we're members of. And I think what is kind of missing in the climate ethics literature is also focused on how it is not just the United States senators and the people who have sitting in the boards of big fossil fuel companies and stuff who have this responsibility. It's also us, and there's also this lot of smaller range collective agents that can make a lot of difference, and they can impact things. And if it doesn't have to be this one giant grand scheme that's coming from above, if we cannot get like the global coordination going, like still, Elinor Ostrom, for example, has written about this in 2010, that how it's still this polycentric governance things can also make a huge difference. And it's kind of like at this point, it's like all hands on deck. So whatever emissions we can reduce, let's do them, especially as members of collective agents. But my point here has been, we have to also discuss the direct individual responsibility of super polluters. So even though I'm all for the collective responsibility, I do think that's the main thing. I really think we should think about our membership of these collective agents. This is still, it's a pressing issue, and it's so like vast that we shouldn't like just let this direct responsibility of individual off the picture. We should have it as part of our overall schema of climate change responsibility. So my conclusions are that there are vast carbon inequalities between countries and within countries and historically. And something that I haven't talked about is in future generations, of course, but this is like, of course, a humongous inequality there. Like we are using up the carbon budget now. We're not really leaving much anything for the future generations, unless we're coming up with amazing ways of carbon capture very soon and other things. But I haven't included that here. And due to these inequalities, climate policies have to take into account individuals and classes. We can't just go in the state level and say like that's done with it. I mean, there's a lot of inequality to be found between states, but also we have to dig in deeper within the states. And I think emissions accounting can motivate and clarify the debate. So the more we have this kind of data and the more we kind of see it either visualized or just read the figures and we're kind of like, wow, okay, that is really off, you know. So I think it's really like, and I'm excited for these new ways like that satellite tracking of really discussing these issues, like, well, who is actually doing the emitting and where. So I think it has its place in like motivating this wider public debate. And I think there's just this new urgency for ethics of individual emissions. And that's something that we should, because the situation is so bad, and that's the driving force of the current uptake of why the emissions are still going up. So I think that's something that we as climate ethicists should be interested about. So thank you for your attention. And I want to thank the Finnish Cultural Foundation for their funding my work at the moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Säde. Now we are going to have a Q&A session, and I want to remind people that we're recording the first half an hour of this. So if for some reason you want to remain anonymous, at least to the outside audience, you can wait with your question until 11:30. People listening in via chat or Zoom, you have been given instruction in the chat how you can pose questions, and I'm going to try to alternate questions between the chat and in person. I'll start with Gustav.
Thanks, it's a great talk.
Thanks.
I should remember this. Huh? It's a great talk, and I think I agree with most of it, but I will get back to this about you never defined super-polluters.
Yep.
And what you indicated about that, I think, is you didn't back it up with any empirical evidence, and I think you might be wrong about it. I mean, you exemplified it with super yachts and space travels. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the top 1%. That's the top 0.1%. And when it comes to space travel, maybe 0.01%. So I think if you could tell me why you think that defines the super polluters. I think rather actually you have quite a number of super polluters in Sweden, and they might have private planes, but they don't have very big yachts, or they don't travel to space. Now, a second question is that in the possible action, if you have this focus on super polluters, I was surprised that you didn't bring up something rather surprising conclusion is that we should focus on developing new technologies that will address the super polluters consumption. Mm-hmm. So actually, from your point of view, it's very good with Tesla and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. You should really look into luxury consumption and how we can produce that in a less in a more climate-friendly way, which is a rather surprising conclusion. Nevertheless, the third question, I think your framework still is, for my taste, all too individualist. I mean, you can count different things, but I think there are only 100 companies that are responsible for over 70% of all the emissions since 1998. So why not focus on the production, the companies? And this is also, in one sense, easier, because we know where they are. They are very easy to target in one way. Although, of course, when it comes to power, it's harder, but where they are. So I wonder about this focus on individuals and consumptions.
Those are great questions. Thank you very much, Gustav. I'm going to start from the, I'm going to answer them the other way around. So starting with the 100 companies. So as I said, like, yeah, this is part of the book. And actually in the book, I have 2 chapters on collective responsibility. One chapter is just purely on companies. And this thing is one section of another chapter. So percentage-wise, I'm actually talking much more about companies. Of course, I didn't talk about it here, but you're absolutely right. And I have also published, based on that Heath's article some 5 years ago, an article on the responsibility of carbon majors. And also, and I think it's especially bad with the kind of misinformation tactics that they've been engaged on. So it's not just that they've been polluting, they've also been really messing the public debate, and they've been messing climate regulation. So they are hugely responsible, and they are like my main target in the book. But yeah, so I am very. It's just here. I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about individuals, but in the book they are playing a minor role. So I'm. But I can easily see, like, I have one slide there where I'm saying collectives are important. That's in this talk it didn't come through, but actually most of my research is on the collectives, so I completely agree with you there. And yeah, we should go after them. And that's actually the carbon tracking, for example, website that is tracking individual companies. So that is something like that there. But at the same time, there's also individual members of these companies, and I think that's something we should also take into account. So corporations don't just go in the certain path, and they are impacted by what their members, and these members can be like people who are working there or shareholders, or stuff is happening, changes are happening because of when people are pushing them or making bad choices in them as well. But those are always questions of collective responsibility when we're thinking with our membership hat on. On the Tesla, yeah, I agree with you. That's something like reducing the emissions of the super polluters. Yeah, if Tesla is going to do that for them, that's great. It would be great to have private jets with solar panels or something. It's
kind of surprising conclusion.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say that that's the main thing. I actually think it's I actually think we really have to I am always a bit skeptical of whenever we're introducing new technologies to solve old problems, there's usually something behind that old problem that's a bit more kind of stronger than just a technological innovation. Not always, but so there is in general of this just some of the the overview articles on just looking at all this literature are really saying that it's unhealthy consumption norms and this crazy competition between the super rich that's actually driving a lot of them. So there's real need, because it doesn't really help anybody if you have then 10 Teslas in your garage, and the biggest Tesla, and so yeah. So I do think it should be green, but that's still not the main thing. We should really be reducing the actual consumption levels. And then on the super polluters, yeah, that's true. I should have I do define it in the draft chapter. I have figures for it and everything, so I don't have them with me at the moment, sorry, but I can send them to you afterwards. But the 1%, for example, is talked about in the Oxfam report, and the Oxfam report is talking about the 1%. And they have they have a box there where they're explaining what all of these reports are saying. There's always a disclaimer that it's really hard to come up with concrete figures for this, because there is not much research on the super polluters, and there is not much openness about it. It's people don't usually so you see the celebrities driving the private jets and stuff, but usually a lot of the CEOs and stuff, they're smarter than that to put pictures on the Instagram. So a lot of the very big polluters are not actually open about it, right? So, and there's this real secrecy around the finances and stuff, and people don't want, it's its own world, and it's hard to. A lot of researchers have said it's kind of hard to penetrate these actual figures here. That it's not. So they have to combine them from a lot of different places. But based on those things that Oxfam have calculated, they are saying that the yachts are a big thing. So flying is a big thing, but the yachts are the other thing that's really big within that 1%.
But I'm questioning that.
Yeah, but that's but Oxfam does have so the report does have this whole box of how they've come up with those figures. Yeah.
Just a follow up to that. How good proxy do you think is taking the 1% riches? Isn't that a good proxy for the 1%? Highest polluters, super polluters.
Yeah, so I'm actually talking about I'm talking about the.
I wasn't clear whether you were talking about the one or the other. Sometimes.
Yeah, so the 1% is the super polluters. Yeah.
But is that because we calculated how much they're polluting, or we're taking the 1% of the richest and assuming that is the biggest polluters?
Yeah. So that's the thing. We are assuming, and I am making that distinction in the draft chapter, right? So we're just saying that I'm saying that there might be people who are super frugal, and maybe they're even giving all their money to environmental charities, and they don't actually spend this time. But it's kind of safe to assume that we're going to find most of the super polluters within the top 1%. So that's what I'm saying in the chapter. I don't think they're saying that in the Oxfam thing, at least I don't remember. But there's this where they're looking at the financial things of these super rich, there's also, they're divided into kind of your next door millionaires, and then the high net worth, there's these high net worth individuals that's then divided into separate categories. So I'm looking at the people at the very top of
And that's
the
pretty
rich
well
thing.
defined through the work of Piketty and others.
Yeah.
So that's not hard to get.
Yeah, no, there is like there is data on it, but just like when we're doing that, what I'm talking about is like data of like actually we don't have any like satellite tracking of what Elon Musk is doing at the moment, you know, with his money, you know. So that's what I was meaning. We just can make assumptions, but I think some of them are kind of safe to say in general that we're going to find them most in that top 1%.
Okay, so we seem to have some technical issues there. We'll come back to you, Pontus, and we'll take a question from Stina.
Thank you. Thanks for this talk. It was very interesting. I have a question regarding the possible actions that you listed for doing something about this, basically. Mm-hmm. So my question is whether, or to what extent you think those actions successfully can target these super polluters, or if it's more actions that can target the 10%. Because I was thinking with things like changing consumption behavior and taxing and things like that. I'm not exactly sure what that entails, but if you think of it as making certain bad products more expensive, for instance, then of course that's not gonna make that much of a difference for the super polluters since they have so much money. And also, I guess you can also, with other taxation incentives, the super polluters might be able to evade that in various ways. So I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about if how you think those actions will target these super polluters, or if you think so, and if so, which of them are most likely to do so?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I don't know if I'm confident enough to say like anything with like definite. These are just my guesses, and first of all, like I just want to clarify. I think that's really good that you brought it up. I do think we should target both the 1% and the 10%, right? Like we need them both. It's a 10% that's driving the emissions altogether. It's just that the 1% is driving it like insanely in it. But we need to. We can't get to anywhere near 1.5% unless the 10% is targeted. And that was a really good point that you said, that look, like if we put like this really, even if you put huge carbon taxes on certain goods that shouldn't be used, you know, it's like some people will have money to use it, you know. So these emissions will still go up. So I think that's why, like maybe when it comes to super polluters, there is actually need to maybe be nasty for a while at least and cut down some of the choices. Of these like really massively polluting things that we're doing. So whether they're super yachts or private jets or space travel, maybe there's certain things. I don't want to be the person who are like stopping all the fun, but you know there's certain things that we should maybe stop all the fun for the time being. It's just a bit gross with what's going on wider at the situation. So there's maybe certain things that need to be stopped for the time being, and the price won't. You're probably right that it's just increasing the carbon taxes won't really solve the problem, and maybe it even becomes even more of a status symbol than like, the price has gone up so much, but I am still here, you know. So yeah, so that won't help it. But yeah, so maybe there should be some choices cut in the 1%, whereas in the 10%, I think it's also a lot to do. I think the carbon taxes will probably work much, you know, like equally there as well. But in both of the groups, I think the main thing is really is this questioning of social standards, and I do around consumption, and I think that's something that should be done everybody together, and I think that should be done in as kind of positive spirit as possible. And it's no, and I'm not saying we should be like, oh, you know, you poor thing, do you have to get rid of your jets, you know, like I feel for you. And I don't mean like going extremes with that, but still like more like the positive vision, you know, like that we're in this together and we want to make things better. And I think most people are motivated that, you know, people don't have usually like, they don't want to drive climate change, right? They don't want to be in this position, They want to find solutions. We need to find them together. So maybe, but because we do need to reduce the consumption. So I think the kind of debates together are something that's very crucial for the both groups.
Thanks.
Good, thank you. We'll try you again now, Pontus, and see if it works better now.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So yeah, very worried about polarization of the debate because when it was still when IPCC first got together and when it was still discussion on Kyoto stuff, it was actual Republicans who were pushing for climate policies in United States. It wasn't this partisan issue. It has only become partisan issue partly because this is very super idealistic lobbying that's been going on there by fossil fuel companies and others. And then in general, the debate in politics, I think, how could that worry? I mean, everybody's worried probably about the polarization in general in society. And especially in politics, because it just makes we can't achieve anything together. So yeah, I'm very worried about it, and especially since it's labeled, and traditionally those kind of things, degrowth and reducing consumption, they come from the left as well. And I'm not saying they're wrong things to promote, it's just that if it becomes this left-right thing and you versus us kind of thing, that doesn't help anybody. So I do think we need people who are not your kind of traditional people who promote this, really to bring this debate forward, And we have business leaders like that as well, and we have other rich people who do that. So I think we really need to hear their voices more. So this would be an opportunity to step up. In terms of the wider thing, the polarization, I don't have answers for that. Maybe participatory democracy can help reduce some of those polarization, at least when you're trying to put forward ambitious climate plans. Usually that it seems to be that people start finding common ground when they have to actually debate each other like human beings face to face. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so I'm worried, but I don't think that's the reason why we still stop the debate. We just have to be very careful about how to frame it.
Good, thank you. We'll take a question from Joe.
Great. Thank you for the talk. I like the focus on the super polluters, but my question is sort of similar to Gustav's about the use of these kind of economic proxies of income, because at sometimes it seemed like you were using the top 1% of global earners, but at other times the charts seem to show the top 1% within countries and then grouping those people. But those are quite different. I mean, the top 1% in India earn $80,000, the top 1% in the US earn $500,000. So they're not going to have the same consumption behaviors. So insofar as your focus is consumption-based, that national lens confused me slightly. And the top 1% globally, which I think is quite a low income threshold to Gustav's point, such that many middle-class Europeans might be in it. Right. There are 80 million of them if there are 8 billion people in the world. That's a very large group of people, not at all plausibly engaged in super yachting. I mean, there are 10,000 super yachts in the world. So so I think I found it confusing who the people were. I'm happy with the notion that we should focus on the super yacht people. I'm also happy with the notion that we should focus on major individual polluters. But I think the proxies for how we identify them, I found to be quite confusing. And in a way that might reinforce some kind of discussions that people have about things like, international questions of justice. Like if your proposal were such that the 70,000 earner in India and the 500,000 earner in the United States were kind of lumped together, that seems kind of objectionable in some way. So yeah, I think these proxies of how we pick them out are going to be quite important.
Yeah, great question, thanks. So I am not wanting to like lump the top 1% from India and the top 1% from United States together. That would make no sense. So I understand completely your point that it was a bit confusing, that I was also showing some things on the inequality within nation states. And anyway, there was lots of data there. That was just really like to hammer it home that I'm not making up these figures. And I think a lot of them are actually quite striking. And what I really like, I first wrote about this in my thesis 5 years ago, and there's just lots more stuff now as well, that's and making things nicely visual and things. So I just got a little bit carried away maybe with the data. But so what I want to say this, so that the 1% was just showing that was supposed to be part of the general background to the question why it doesn't make sense to divide the emissions between states. So that was in that section that I was giving the kind of national 1%. And then when I was talking about the super polluters, the 1% was the global elite. And you will have some people in India totally on that. There is like sections there, not just Bollywood stars, but there will be people who really earning a lot. Some of the richest people in the world are in India. They're having incredible lifestyles in terms of if you want a glitz and glamour and expensive goods. So those people absolutely should be in the super polluters, because it makes no sense that we would just leave them out of these responsibility discussions just because they happen to be based in India. That would be very arbitrary.
Sure.
So
maybe just the 1% is too big a number then, because that's 80 million people worldwide.
Yeah, it might be, but so the reason I am talking about the 1% though is because all these reports are talking about 1%. It's kind of like a clear way of like having some data on that. This is like it's a vast problem and it's a global problem, right? So all the available data is discussing 1% globally. What that's really like honing in on that. And I'm not that much of a data whiz that I can start coming up with my own things, but I am. I am like making it a bit more fine-grained, the argument, through these high net worth individual stuff that I'm discussing in the book. I mean, this is always the the nonsense way out of questions, like it's there and you can't read it, but believe me, I have dealt with it. So just have to take my word for it. So I'm trying to address that there. So, but this again, the yacht example is not my own. That is coming from the Oxfam data. So maybe, and it doesn't mean that they're all going around the 1% with yachts, It just means that within that 1%, surprising amount coming from yachts. That's maybe the argument. So then, of course, then you're looking at the super polluters there, right? And that's what I'm trying to do with the high net worth individuals. And then that's like, then that gets you like, well, what's your main responsibility? Like, I think maybe if you are, say, the spouse or a child of some really super rich person, and you are the one who's like, oh, can't we get the new yacht, That is then your private, that is your main climate change responsibility. Your consumption standards are whack, and somehow that should be brought in under control, right? But then if you are that other person who is buying the yacht, because their kid is nagging them. I don't know if this is realistic at all, probably not. But anyway, so that person is probably a CEO of some huge company, or they're a politician, or they're both, or they have huge financial investments here and there. that is not their main concern, still. Their main responsibility, I mean. They should care about the yacht, but they should care about what they're doing in their super so we have the super polluters who are also powerful agents. So, and I'm not saying they're evil. So they're not. I don't have like this. I wish like climate change was Lord of the Rings and we could go and defeat Sauron. Like I would love that. But those are the people who have incredibly crazy responsibilities, and I think it's like weird if you don't discuss that. This is like there are problems that we're kind of causing together, like biodiversity and other things that are much more. I mean, there's people who are contributing to that much more than others, but climate change is really unequal problem. So that's just the main thing. But you're right. I need to like go more into details of the people within that, and then the people within that group, and and just saying like I won't be able to say that. Like people are feeling like, oh my God, am I in her category? I would tell you probably those figures, but I will just refer to what's out there. But I will have to make those more fine-grained distinctions between the super polluters themselves as well. So thank you.
Okay, so we have a quick follow-up from Gustav on this point.
Sorry, I'm going to press this point again. I think still there is a problem because the 1%, the way you talk about it, might not at all be the super polluters. So, for example, in Sweden we have 500,000 of them, according to Credit Suisse. So that will be a 70-year-old pensioner that paid off their house. So it seems to be when you talk about super polluters, I think what you really are after is 0.1% or something like that. So that is a problem in the paper. It's not just a thing that what you seem to be talking about is something else than the top 1%.
No, I think I'm talking about super polluters that can be found within the top 1%. So, I mean, and of course, as I said, because we don't have, it would be great if we would have that kind of a smartwatch attached to the top one's wrist, and then we could find out who are the actual super polluters. And you're right, there will be people who are just not going to be emitting. They're hanging around with their cat, and they're not.
It's not that they're hanging around with cat. It's just that there's such a big category. So realize that a pensioner in Sweden paid off their house is in the top 1%.
Yeah, but I mean. But at the same time, it is sensible to talk about that category, because that is still where the lots of other people in that category are driving the global emissions higher, right? It's also where the trends are, who is becoming here. Like it's people in especially China, that's the big concern of people like really going higher there. And as I said, like if I want to make something sensible out of this, I still have to refer to the existing categories, but I do make the distinction that it doesn't mean that just because you are there based on your income that you're necessarily a super polluter. It's more like we're going to find them there. But I will not have the kind of empirical data that I can tell you who is one and who is not. But I agree that it's like it is a thing that you have to be like very careful when you're like putting these labels on people. Those categories aren't like exactly the same.
Good. Thank you. We'll take a question online from Kian.
don't. I think you're completely right that when it comes to things like carbon taxes or cap and trade, it doesn't actually necessarily make much of a policy difference whatsoever. And I think one of the things that, it's kind of hard to run together in climate ethics is in general like that you need to talk about the policy implications, because otherwise why are you doing climate ethics? But then there's the responsibility question. So I do think this makes a big impact on the kind of how we are addressing climate responsibilities for individuals. So I think in the terms of just if you're purely looking at moral responsibility questions, I do think this is important. In terms of policy recommendations, in a lot of things, I think you're right. It doesn't. It's just part of the kind of general tone. So it wouldn't like maybe make a difference in carbon taxes, for example. But there might be some things that it might make a difference. I have to think about this more. And I'm thinking of maybe that cutting down some of the choices, for example, where there's been a lot of pushback on me, like showing the Oxfam examples, and I understand that, and it's like, and it could be like, if the politician is like, well, we're going to introduce like these massive tax or like reducing like that you can't have super yachts and space travel can't happen in 10 years. Like people are like, why on earth are you concentrating on such nonsense issues? Like what, So there might be some like then you have to bring out like, well, actually there's the super polluters, and within that category, these are driving a lot of emissions. So maybe there is some, in that sense, there might be some policy implications. And with the space travel, what I forgot to say earlier as well, so that problem is not so much, according to Oxfam, what's happening with space travel right now. It's that it's something that's starting now, and there's competition in it, and it's something that's projected to take off soon. So this is, again, like what's happening in the next 10, 20 years. So, do we want to kind of cut off those kinds of emissions? And I feel so bad giving this example all the time. I love space. I would love to go there. But like, maybe that is something that we should like nip in the bud now before it becomes like this wider problem, right? So it's more about the stuff the trends that we already have and where they might lead. So maybe there is some policy implications there.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a question from Julia.
Thank you for the talk. So I've been thinking about one of the remarks that Gustav made before, that your approach still sounds a little bit individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, this might be a stretch, but I was wondering if you would be willing to see the 1% or the 0.5% group of super polluters as a collective itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see how it can be different, or they can be different from the stereotypical collectives to which we're traditionally willing to attribute action and responsibility, collective action and collective responsibility, like companies. But I think that there's still some similarities with those. So super polluters presumably share goals and interests, right? So they're interconnected at the business level, at the social level, so on and so forth. And they're presumably also organized in some sense to protect those shared goals and interests that they might have in common. And there might be some more similarities that I cannot think of right now. So I was just wondering if you would be willing to consider them as a collective, and if so, what would that imply at their responsibility level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. I would be willing to consider them, and that's why I actually I want to call them super polluters. I don't want to talk about individual people by names and stuff. So definitely, I think, and as you pointed out, these really good things like, there's this interconnected, shared goals, shared interests, like shared ways of doing things. And I think this is where, so you kind of have to also so what we're talking about is what I call unorganized collective. So we have these organized collective agents, like states and corporations, universities, Institute for Future Studies, and they have their own like membership criteria, and they're like leaders and stuff, and their ethos and whatnot. And then we have unorganized collectives that are like somehow normatively interesting, a group of like it says aggregate of people picked out by some normatively relevant fact. So in this sense, it's like that you're a super polluter. And then I think it does make sense to discuss the responsibilities of that group, and that because that would be like, because you're sharing the norms and stuff. So for example, all these norm and value debates, that's something that this group has to also have within itself, and then maybe they need to organize to become like, maybe they need like an active subset that they have to maybe collectivize to like address some of these issues. So first people have to have awareness, hey, I'm part of the problem causing group, and then what should we do about it, like within that. They can be forced, of course, by outside forces and stuff, but I think it's very unlikely here as well, because a lot of the political and economic power is there as well. So it has to be coming, it has to be also driven by some super polluters within that group to kind of get that stuff moving. And again, if possible, try to do it in some like positive way and stuff. But I do think it absolutely matters that they are an organized group, and it makes sense to discuss them. When it comes then to like kind of how do we assign responsibilities to constituents of unorganized groups, then it gets really much more complicated. And that's why I have a whole chapter on that. But yeah, that's the main thing. It's about like, it's really about these shared values. So you put your finger on something very important. Great, thank you very much. Great questions. So on the consumption-based and production-based, so I just went with like I am not like this workshop. Like there's people who are the experts in that thing here, and I am not one of them. But so I just went with like I just thought like kind of like let's just go with what IPCC's latest data says, and I was actually a little bit surprised by that as well. I was expecting to find like bigger differences. I am sure I have to now check. So thank you very much for the thing about the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. So I want to check that data, and I should probably see like in general like that it has to be just different ways of how these things are accounted and to see if there's and if anybody here has some good literature on that they want to recommend to me, that would be great. But yeah, thank you. I will check that out. I don't have an answer to that. On the population and sustainability, I took it your comment was just that I didn't discuss population, but that it kind of makes sense because population in itself doesn't necessarily drive emissions. So so that was exactly the reason, like because there's often, especially with like, well, maybe that has reduced, but at least there's been a tradition of this kind of like certain type of politician going like, well, what does it matter what we do in Finland because there's all these people elsewhere and this keeps growing, and that's not really the point in itself. It's like it's kind of what kind of consumption those people are doing. But of course overpopulation is a problem, but then that's why we need to really invest in women. And then and the collective harm problem, I didn't spend so much time on it because it's you could spend a whole 45 minutes discussing that, but if you're interested, like I would be happy to send you like links to articles and other stuff on it. If you send me an email, and I can send you more material on that if you find it interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. About the first question, I mean, I've looked into it a little bit, and I think part of the explanation is that Sweden and Scandinavia in general are the countries where the difference is actually biggest between production and consumption-based accounting, because the export sector is pretty green, and there's just a lot of emissions embodied in the stuff we import. So Scandinavia and Switzerland and some other northern European countries, and maybe they are hidden in the European averages. I don't recall now how big the difference was, the Europe-wide difference that you showed us. I don't remember, but maybe that's eaten up by other European countries. Okay.
Thank you.
I have a small comment to that. Thank you. One of the things that make a difference between those two in Denmark is ships, because they don't count in the national accounting, but they would figure in a consumption-based accounting somewhere at least.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you. We'll take the final question from Pierre.
Thank you very much. I really like that you emphasized the rise in transnational inequality, which is often overlooked by our philosophical discussions of individual responsibility. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the precise ethical justifications of the possible actions that you listed, like progressive carbon taxation, extreme wealth taxation, or even choice editing. It seems to me that such measures can't be justified in terms of welfare maximizing efficiency, because, like according to the textbook definition of a Pareto optimal carbon tax, it needs to be a single price, possibly global. Therefore, is it justification in terms of effectiveness? Like $100 carbon tax doesn't have any impact on Jeff Bezos if he wants to travel to space. Is it justifications in terms of fairness? And if yes, is that more of a maximum egalitarian argument, like super yachts and space tourism do not benefit the least advantage? Or is it rather a limitarian argument in terms of relational equality or something like that? I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great question. I think I'm going to disappoint you with my answer. I haven't had that much time to think about those. So those were things that I picked up from the literatures. I just looked at so what is the literature that's talking about this problem? What is it giving as kind of as concrete policy proposals? Because I always like to kind of bring the philosophy to the practical world as well. But I have not looked at yet like the kind of what kind of justification and principles there would be. I think in overall, like it's questions of fairness that's driving my my concern. So that would be like the overarching thing. But then of course when you were coming up with like choosing which policies to actually choose, then of course we need to also come up with like effectiveness. Like if you have like two policies, the other much more effective but not necessarily fair, but that will lead to a more fairer outcome. You know, you need to factor these in. I am not sure if I will even like go into it and have those kinds of answers, because my point is kind of more limited, because that's it just seems I think it's important, but it seems very also ambitious if I would want to like say like, well, what should we do? And I'm not sure if philosophers are the best place to do it anyway. And then it kind of like, or would it add anything to that particular thing? Because I think these are the kind of debates that need to happen in the more like participatory democracy thing, or within the kind of questioning of social norms areas. But yeah, I think that's a great question, but I don't know if I will go into answering it, but definitely fairness is kind of there, always at the back of my mind.
Good, thank you, and please join me in thanking Säde for a stimulating talk and discussion.